Have you ever driven down a road where every shadow seems alive? Where the very tarmac seems cursed? The A666 motorway is more than just a sinister name. It's a portal to something that not everyone can escape. Do you want to know what happened to me that night? Then stay until the end. If you've heard of this road or know of another sinister story, comment here. Oh, and don't forget to sign up for more stories like this. It was an ordinary Friday, or at least it seemed that way. I had an urgent job in Blackburn, something that couldn't wait until Monday. Time was tight, and although the maps suggested alternative routes, I chose the A666, the road that cut through the heart of Lancashire. It seemed a logical decision, but as I passed the first few kilometres, a feeling of unease came over me. It wasn't the kind of thing you can easily explain, like a cold breeze that comes out of nowhere, or the weight of someone staring at you, even when you're alone. The A666 was a road that had already earned a bad reputation among the locals. Devil's Highway, they called it. I heard stories as a child, stories that we laughed about at first, but which, on dark nights, seemed to take on a life of their own. They said that the road was a shortcut to hell, and every kilometre travelled was a silent pact with something that dwelled beyond our understanding. It was nonsense, of course, but even so, when I got on the road that night, something felt wrong. The surrounding landscape, normally inviting during the day, became something out of a nightmare at night. Ancient trees lined the road like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching and writhing in the dim light of the headlights. The moon was high, but seemed indifferent, hidden by thick clouds that refused to dissipate. The road was deserted, except for me and the monotonous sound of tyres on tarmac. The temperature inside the car seemed to have dropped. I switched on the heater, but it insisted on blowing icy air. I was beginning to think my mind was playing tricks on me. But the radio, which was tuned to a rock station, started to squeak. Suddenly, an old song full of squeaks and static took over. The voice sounded like it was from another era, as if it was being played on a rusty gramophone. It must be interference, I thought, but the discomfort grew. Even with the radio off, the music continued faintly, like a whisper in the background. It was then that I began to realize it wasn't just paranoia. Something was out of place. The road seemed longer than it should be. I looked at the GPS. It was blinking, unable to connect to any signal. The stories I had heard as a child began to resurface in my mind, each one more disturbing than the last. A missing couple, a lorry driver found dead with strange marks on his body, and the most famous legend, the woman in white who walked along the side of the road, hitchhiking. The more I drove, the more the road seemed to swallow me up. The mist began to rise, creeping across the surface as if it had a life of its own. It was thick and oppressive, and my headlights were practically useless. I looked in the rearview mirror. Darkness. I looked ahead. More fog. And then, in the middle of the road, something changed. I don't know how long it had been since I'd entered that road, but the dashboard clock was stuck on 23:37. I blinked, trying to shake off the tiredness, but the sight ahead seemed like a trick of the lights, something my mind couldn't immediately process. In the middle of the mist, a figure slowly emerged. He was standing still, his hands stuffed into the pockets of a long, worn jacket. The light from the headlights didn't illuminate his face, as if the man himself was repelling the light. Instinctively, I slowed down, but not enough to come to a complete stop. It was as if my body knew this wasn't normal. Something told me to keep going, but my curiosity, always a treacherous ally, made me hesitate. As I passed him, a subtle movement caught my eye. He turned his head, not quickly, like someone startled by a sudden sound, but slowly, deliberately, as if he already knew I would be there. For a brief moment, our eyes met. I couldn't see any details, but it felt as if a cold hand was squeezing my throat. I kept driving, trying to ignore the shiver that ran up my spine. My fingers were so stiff on the steering wheel that my joints began to ache. I looked in the rear-view mirror to confirm that he had disappeared. He hadn't. The man was now standing in the middle of the road, watching me even as I drove away. "It's not possible," I muttered, but my voice sounded strangely loud in the silence of the car. I accelerated, the tires skidding slightly on the damp asphalt, but instead of gaining distance, the feeling of being followed only increased. The road seemed endless. Each bend was identical to the last, and the trees seemed to close in around me. The branches snapped in the wind, but the sound was muffled, as if it came from somewhere else. Then the radio squawked again. This time, it wasn't music, it was something human. A deep voice, almost a whisper, echoed through the speakers. It wasn't English, or at least not English that I could understand. The words were disjointed, but the intonation was clear. Threat. I turned up the volume in an attempt to decipher, but the voice stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural laugh. I looked again through the rearview mirror. He was closer now, walking along the side of the road. It couldn't be real. Nobody can walk that fast. It was then that I realized that the lights of another car were shining in the distance. It was my chance. I accelerated, concentrating on the lights that seemed further and further away. But as I got closer, I saw that the other car was stationary, with its headlights still on. A shiver went through me when I realized why. The doors were open, but the driver was nowhere to be seen. The car was stationary there, but the silence that enveloped the moment was not normal for a deserted road. Something was wrong, and the feeling that I was being watched grew more and more, tightening my chest. I looked out of the window, but nothing, not a soul alive. There were no cars passing by, no figures moving in the shadows of the trees. What I knew deep down was that I shouldn't have stopped. The road seemed to swallow me up, pulling me in, making me forget the need to move on. I tried to switch on the radio, something to dispel the silence, but it did nothing but emit a static hiss. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. And that's when I realized that the fog ahead, that same thick fog that had covered the road, now seemed denser. My vision became blurred, and for a moment, it seemed as if the whole world had stopped. It was as if the road was stretching out into the distance, without end, like a nightmare of impossible dimensions. The car door was locked, but the feeling that something or someone was there, within sight, made it impossible to breathe. The car's headlights illuminated just enough to give a touch of reality to what I was seeing. However, the shadow of the man was still in my mind, even though I knew I couldn't see him anymore. He was there, watching me, even when my eyes could no longer detect his physical presence. The radio crackled once more, and now Instead of a voice, something more sinister took over the speakers. It was a low, repetitive murmur. The words that made no sense began to form a strange melody, almost as if someone was singing. But the intonation was crooked, dissonant, like a chant from something very old and distant. Each sound cut through my mind like sharp knives, leaving me anxious and disorientated. Then the headlights went out. Everything went dark, dense, impenetrable. The car was stationary in an abyss of darkness, and the road ahead stretched out like an endless expanse of fear. No light, no sound. The fog seemed to swallow up everything around me. In a desperate attempt, I turned the car key to restart the engine. But as if I had been cursed, nothing happened. The car remained silent, like a closed cage, imprisoning me there. And just as my heart was racing, something touched the window. Not a knock, but a scratch. It felt as if someone's fingernails were scratching the surface, relentlessly. The sound was louder now, and even if I looked, nothing moved. But I knew something was there, on the other side of the glass. It was then that something much stronger than reason took hold of me. Fear. The kind of fear you feel when you realize that something supernatural, something that shouldn't be there, is about to reveal itself. I didn't know whether to get out of the car or stay. But the mere fact of being there gave me the impression of being inside a horror story, one that no one should ever live through. The feeling was that the road, that particular road, was alive, an entity that was feeding off my hesitation. And then a laugh, a low, guttural laugh coming from nowhere. It seemed to fill the air, reverberating in my bones. It was a laugh that made no sense, but at the same time seemed like an invitation. Something was calling me, inviting me to walk into the unknown, to move forward. I knew it was a trap. I knew it, but my body didn't respond. The car light flashed once, and in that second, the figure appeared in front of me again, closer. It emerged from the mist, a human shadow, standing there motionless, just watching. The eyes, no, there were no eyes. There was just emptiness. The sensation was that darkness itself had taken them over. And in that void, something much worse was hiding. Now I knew. The A666 road wasn't just a road. It was a portal. A path to something much older, much more horrible than any story or legend could tell. And it was calling me inside. I was about to cross over to another place. The vision distorted. The road was no longer a road. It was an extension of the night, and I was in a limbo between worlds. The wind beat against the windows, but made no sound, as if the air itself was trapped in a place where sound no longer existed. All that remained was darkness and a growing sense of claustrophobia. The seat was freezing. My body was shivering, but the cold wasn't coming from outside. It was spreading from the inside out, like a spectral presence taking over every cell. I didn't know what was making me stay there. Panic consumed me. And the car, like a prison, seemed to be protecting me and condemning me at the same time. The fog thickened even more, covering the landscape and obscuring the horizon. It was as if the road was an endless tunnel, and I was forced to follow it. Worst of all, I knew there was no escape. The figure that had appeared before, that faceless shadow, now seemed to be getting closer. Something was wrong. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel its gaze, fixed, implacable. That presence was watching me, studying me, as if it knew that fear was already beginning to dominate my mind. The kind of fear that has no explanation, the kind that goes beyond human comprehension, the fear of something that shouldn't be there. I took a deep breath, trying to think of a way out of the situation. I looked at the car doors, all locked. The engine still wouldn't start. I was trapped in that circle of terror and uncertainty, and the feeling that something unspeakable was about to happen was growing by the second. And that's when I heard the sound again, the scratching. It was as if the tarmac itself had come to life and was trying to drag me out of the car. The sound was unbearable, louder than before, and it seemed to be coming from everywhere. My heart raced. I knew I shouldn't open the window, but the feeling that something was about to break the barrier between what was real and what was beyond human comprehension made me act. I took a step towards the door, my sweaty hands gripping the steering wheel. But before I could open the window, the figure appeared again. This time, it was no longer in human form. It was a thing, a mass of wriggling and writhing shadows, a thing impossible to describe. It grew, expanded, swallowing up everything around it, and its presence seemed to make the temperature around me drop even more. What I felt wasn't fear, it was sheer terror, a sense of powerlessness so overwhelming that any attempt at resistance seemed futile. I could no longer move, not even breathe. The figure was silent now, but its gaze, or whatever that faceless void was on me. It was as if something was pushing me towards the inevitable, towards the unknown. I looked around, desperate for a way out, but there was none. The road, which had once seemed like an ordinary thoroughfare, was now a sentence. There was no turning back. Then the car's headlights came on again, but they no longer illuminated the road. They illuminated something behind me, a field of dense fog, darker than any shadow I had ever seen. It was as if space itself had warped, as if the road was a door leading to something much, much worse. I tried to turn the car key once more, but nothing happened. I was trapped, stuck in limbo between reality and imminent death. For a moment, the road disappeared in front of me, and all that remained was a vast darkness. There was no sky, no stars, nothing else, just the feeling that something was about to swallow everything up, swallow me up, and the figure, that faceless void, was now right in front of me, more real than ever. I could no longer tell if I was awake, or if I had been taken to a place where time no longer existed. Whatever that place was, it wasn't mine. I knew I had crossed a line, and the A666 road was now no longer just a road. It was the door to another world. And then, finally, the voice. It wasn't a normal voice. There was nothing human about it. It was a whisper that seemed to come from the wind itself, a broken, distorted voice that whispered words that I couldn't understand, but that I knew deep down I shouldn't hear. Each word echoed in my mind like a warning, a curse. You shouldn't have come. The A666 motorway wasn't just a road. It was a call, a sentence from someone who dares to defy what should not be touched. I knew then that I would never see the world as I had before. The silence after that whisper was worse than any noise. I felt as if everything around me had stopped, frozen in time, and at the same time, It was something so great and terrifying that just my presence there seemed absurd. The feeling of being on another plane intensified, and the only thing that remained was fear. A deep, soul-wrenching fear. The figure, or rather, that which had no form, approached once again. I felt an unbearable weight in my chest, as if the very air was suffocating me. But it wasn't just fear that consumed me now. It was the feeling that, by looking at that faceless entity, I was seeing something that shouldn't be seen. Something that should never be awakened. With an effort, I turned the car key once more. The engine failed again. The road now seemed to stretch on endlessly, and what lay ahead was no longer the A666 motorway, but an endless abyss. What I saw was no longer the reality I knew, but an eternal nightmare with no escape. I knew that once I got out of there, I would never return to my world. It was then, in the midst of that vacuum of fear and despair, that my mind began to understand what was happening. I was being taken to a place where the rules didn't apply, where there was no longer any control. The road, that damned path, wasn't just a route between places. It was a door, a passage between the world of the living and something much, much darker. And the moment I realized that, the sight of the road was absorbed by the darkness. There was no path ahead, just an immense void with no sign of life or hope, as if the universe itself had undone what we know as reality. I was trapped, and there was no way back. I looked in the rearview mirror, hoping to see the headlights of some car, some light that would get me out of there, but there was nothing, just the expanding darkness, swallowing everything. It was then that I knew the Devil's Road in Lancashire wasn't just a story. It was the truth, a truth that I was now part of. There was no more salvation. And that's where I leave you with the question. Do you have the courage to travel along the A666? Do you know what's really waiting around every bend? Because what happened to me and what I saw there is something that no one should ever have to witness. So, if you liked this story, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and of course, comment below on what you think the A666 really is. Would you have the courage to face what I did? I want to know what you think. Let's talk about it in the comments. And before I forget, activate your bell, because there are many more terrifying stories coming up, and you don't want to miss them. See you in the next video, and until then, take care, because there are things in this world that are not meant to be seen.